So this gives me the opportunity to introduce Stephanie Antequino, who's the collections manager at the Orange County Regional History Center, and will start us off with documentation.
Good morning, everyone. As I was preparing this, I realized that I could have gone on for hours and hours and hours about documentation, especially from the museum point of view, but I won't bore you, so I won't do that. But I have had to limit the information that I'm giving you, so I know as with all of the presentation, it's just the basic information. So later on, if you do have additional questions, you can contact me by email or through the Connecting to Collections program that we have. So documentation is, you can read this along with me, it's the supporting evidence, and you want to record that in a permanent manner. And you can use that, and do so in a variety of media. It's going to provide the identification, condition, history, use, and value of the collection. This can be done through digital images, through audio recordings, notes that you take as you're speaking with donors or doing research on artifacts, letters written back and forth, receipts, not money, well, monetary receipts as well as donation receipts, photographs, books, etc. Why do you want to have a documentation system? It's proof of what the collection object is, where it came from, it shows what has happened to it, and it shows the proof of ownership. So you want to know what you have in your collection. Did you purchase it from someone? Was it donated? What has happened to it? That could be, has there been conservation work performed on it, the exhibit history, loan history, and then of course proof of ownership. Do you actually have physical ownership of that or legal ownership of it? Documentation systems are the primary means by which a museum exerts the intellectual and physical control over the collection. And having a good documentation system allows you to retrieve information no matter what form. So you always want to be able to access the information, whether it's catalog records in your computer or the paper records that you have on your files. In order to have a good documentation system, you want to be clear, avoiding jargon and slang. And sometimes this is difficult, especially when using museum terminology as far as describing things. If you do use things that you think might be a little bit difficult for those who are not in the museum world to understand, use a glossary. And using drawings, photographs, and other permanent information, other permanent images for additional information is always good as well. That's why within our catalog records that we have, we use Past Perfect at the History Center. We always make sure that we photograph all of our objects. I know when, almost 20 years ago in college, when I was working in an archaeology lab, I had to inventory flint chips, and I had to use these little drawings that came in from the field to identify them, but they were very, very helpful. You also want your documentation to be permanent. If you can, use acid-free paper, light, fast, non-acidic ink, so preferably not an inkjet printer. And then make sure to back up your electronic data, and since technology is so rapidly changing, if you are able to transfer it from one generation of electronic memory to the next. Hopefully you don't have records still on floppies. Hopefully they've all gone to CDs or external drives. You want to be legible. You want to print rather than use cursive. If you can, use a pen, not a pencil, and make sure that you're using archival materials. I can't tell you how many times I've gone back looking through my old paperwork, even my own, my old donor ledgers, and trying to figure out somebody's name, trying to figure out what they have. And you also want to be comprehensive, serving as a record of all of the activities that affect the collection. The documentation policy ensures that the museum will manage all of the collection documentation properly, both written and electronic. It outlines the types of records that will be kept. You want to make sure that you have in there what types of information it will contain and who is responsible for keeping the information. You want to ensure that the records are updated regularly and permanently maintained, and that duplicate records should be kept in a separate location. I have records dating back to the 1940s, and I'm still in the process of copying all of those onto archival acid-free paper and transferring those records, the duplicate records, out to our off-site storage facility. That way, if something were to happen in my registrar office at the museum, I would have backup copies at a safe location. There are documentation standards out there. AAM has the national standards and best practices. There's standards for collection stewardship. States that stewardship is the careful, sound, and responsible management of what is entrusted to a museum's care, and that possession of collections incurs legal, social, and ethical obligations, provides proper physical storage, management, and care for the collections and associated documentation, as well as proper intellectual control. If you don't have a copy of this publication, you can get it from the AAM website. If you are an institutional member, you can get a PDF for free. Otherwise, I believe the book costs $14.95 from the bookstore. And again, the standards require that a system of documentation records management and inventory is in effect to describe each object and its acquisition, whether it be permanent or temporary acquisition, the current condition and location, movement into and out of and within the collection, within the museum, sorry. The American Association for State and Local History has the STEPS program, which stands for Standards and Excellence Program for History Organizations. And within that, there are several standards. There's the one that relates to what we're working on is the Stewardship of Collections, Standard 2, where the institution legally, ethically, and effectively manages, documents, cares for, and uses the collection. Unfortunately, there are several additional standards that go along with this particular subject within the STEPS workbook, but if I put them all in here, we'd be here for an hour. They are divided between not good, better, best, but it's basic, good, and better. So basic might be something like you have a plan in place that says that you have documentation, and then better might say that you use these specific forms, and then the best is that the forms are revised every so many years. So if you are interested in this, I've copied all of the pages that pertain to the stewardship of collections, and I could send that to you, or I could put it on the Connecting Collections forum so that it's available for everyone. Or you can also contact AASLH and get involved in the STEPS program. As far as temporary custody, what does that mean? We use temporary custody forms for something that's coming into the museum that we think we might want to accept as a donation. Elements of a temporary custody form include a tracking number, the name, address, telephone number, and email of the person who brought in the item, the date that you received it, a brief description, a date that it's to be returned, and the signature of the individual who brought the item in, as well as the accepting museum staff member. And I'm not sure if you can see this very well, but this is our temporary custody receipt. For those of you that do use Past Perfect is great because they have these forms already in there, so you can tweak them to fit the needs of your organization. You can see on our front page, we have the information for spaces for all of the contact information, as well as whether or not it's being received as a donation, for us to identify, for something just to photograph. And the important part that a lot of times our staff members forget to do is if we decide that we do not want the item, is the patron going to pick it up? Do they want it back? Or can we just do whatever we want with it? And more times than not, they say that we can just do whatever they want because they don't really want it. And this is also good for those of you that deal with doorstep donations. We leave this form down at our front desk. Admittedly, it doesn't always get used, but we do leave this at the front desk so that if on the weekend somebody comes in and brings something, we ask our front desk staff to have the individual complete this form so that we have a record of who brought in the item and we can contact them if necessary. We also use the temporary custody screen within PastPerfect so that everything is recorded. And you can see that I have the description. These were a bunch of maps and abstracts of title that were brought in. And you can see up at the top that we actually did accession this donation. The deed of gift states that the person who owns the property is donating it to the museum free of restrictions, or if there are restrictions, describes them in detail. We try to accept donations with no restrictions, but that's not always a possibility. So occasionally we do have those, and we make sure that that is described on the deed of gift. It also confirms the donor's belief that they own the object and that they have the ability to pass title. And this is really interesting. We just dealt with an estate. Our local tax collector passed away earlier in the year, and we were dealing with the lawyer for the estate who said, yes, I have free and clear, we can give you all of these materials. So we brought in all of the materials, accessioned them, and then just last week the tax collector's nephew came in and took all of these photographs, and then our curator contacted the attorney and said, this is what happened. The attorney then said, oh yeah, the church might want some information or might want some of the materials as well. So we're going to de-accession this collection and just give it all back to the attorney because the individuals who thought that they had the correct ability to pass title did not. It's a very complicated issue. You also want to make sure you have the date of transfer, again, the donor's contact information, the description of the donor, and you want to make sure you have that signature of the donor as well as the individual who's accepting the donation. And here's a copy of our deed of gift. Again, PastPerfect has this. We take this basically from PastPerfect. Under our conditions, we have put a little bit more information that relates directly to us. So we have tweaked that some. When you're doing the description of the gift, I would say be as detailed as possible because I have several donations from the 70s that say, lot of old photographs. Well, that's great. I have over 16,000 old photographs in my collection, so I don't know as if I'm ever going to be able to actually match those up with the donor. I have no idea what photographs they brought. So if you can be as detailed as possible, you don't have to give dimensions or anything like that, but if you get, in my example, my case, I would maybe get some photographs of Orange Avenue and stuff. I could say that I received 10 black and white photographs of Orange Avenue for the 1920s. That would help me out a lot. And again, here's our accession record. You can see all the information. And this one I did put in the notes. There's no restrictions, but I put in the notes. This was a fraternity initiation paddle that was received. And so the donor gave us information to go along with that, and so I made sure to put that in the notes, and then I can put that in my provenance when I actually catalog the item. And here's a catalog record. This is actually something that was found in the collections. This was purchased for a traveling exhibit that we had several years ago, but we did have some information on the employee who wore it because his name was actually on the hard hat. And so I put that in the provenance along with information on the Titan project. Your incoming loan record should contain a tracking number, the lender's contact information, loan dates. Make sure you have a beginning and ending date, the purpose of the loan, the description, condition, and value of the objects on loan. I know sometimes this is difficult, and to be quite honest, we don't always get a value of objects that are on loan. An indication of who will carry insurance, this is something that I always make sure that I include in my information. And again, you want to make sure you have the signature of the lender and the museum representative. And here's our incoming loan agreement. And you can see up at the top, there's the information for the lender's information. And then I have right below that what the purpose of the loan is going to be for. The loan terms, we like to do our loans for a term of 1 year. So every year we would renew the loan. This is what I recommend, but I know some institutions will do maybe a 2-year loan or a 5-year loan. But then it gets a little bit more difficult because then you're not in contact with that individual on a yearly basis, and it makes it a lot easier to lose the contact information and then fall under that old loan category that we'll discuss in a little bit. And here's our incoming loan information. This was something that we received from the Museum of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia for an exhibit that we had. And you can see that there was a restriction with this loan. There was no photography other than for the documentation purposes. So we made sure that we put that in there so that we knew that we couldn't photograph it and that people coming in to visit the exhibit should not be photographing it as well. Florida Statute 265.565 discusses property loan to museums, the obligations to the lenders, notice, loan termination, acquisition of titles, liens, conservation, or disposal. They describe the lender as an individual or corporation, partnership, trust, or estate whose name is on the record of the museum as legally having control of the property that's on loan to the museum. The term loans, loaned, or on loan refers to the property in the possession of the museum that is not accompanied by a transfer of title, so something that has not been donated to you and is not part of your permanent collection. A museum is defined as public or private not-for-profit agency or institution located within the state and organized on a permanent basis for educational, scientific, or aesthetic purposes. And it's an institution that owns or uses the tangible objects, cares for them, or exhibits them to the public on a regular basis. Property is all of the tangible objects in the custody of the museum, and the records or museum records are those documents created or held by a museum in its regular course of business. So again, here we go with Florida statute saying that you need to have records in order to be able to carry out your business properly. Unclaimed property, and this is very, very important, is property which is on loan to the museum to which the lender or anyone acting on their behalf, so it could be an heir if the lender has passed away, or if it's from an institution, it could be the contact person. This person has not contacted the museum for at least 25 years from the date of the beginning of the loan, if the loan was for an indefinite or undetermined period. So what that means is if there was no end date on your loan, it's considered unclaimed property if that person who owns the item has not contacted the museum for 25 years past the date when the item was received. So, or for at least 5 years after the date upon which the loan for a definite period expired. So if I had a loan that expired last week, I can't call that an unclaimed property until 5 years from now if I don't hear from the lender. The obligations of museums to lenders are to make and retain a written and signed record containing at least the lender's name, address, and telephone number, the description of the loaned property, which includes the general conditions. So you want to make sure that you are taking condition notes when you're receiving loaned property, a loan beginning date, and a loan expiration date. And you want to make sure that you inform the lender of the provisions in the Florida Statute 265.565. We have on the back side of our incoming loan agreement that we comply with this Florida statute, and we have the number there. You're also obligated to update the records with any change of address, ownership, or loan duration. So make sure, I just actually received something in the mail the other day for a loan that's expired, but she apparently had moved and just found the paperwork in a box and sent me her new address, and which is great. So now I have to send out a new loan to her with a new expiration date since that loan has expired. It is the responsibility of the lender to notify the museum in writing of any address or ownership changes, and failure to notify may result in the owner's loss of rights to the property. Termination of loans can be undertaken by the museum for unclaimed property by making a good faith and reasonable search for the identity and last known address of the lender. If the identity is known, the museum shall give notice by sending a certified letter to the lender's last known address. And you want to make sure that that letter contains the date of notice of termination, so when did the loan expire. You want to make sure that you have the name of the lender, the description of the property, and the very first one, the date of loan termination. That would be if the loan has passed for 5 years and you're notifying them today, so you want to make sure you date the letter. And then you want to make sure you have the loan termination date as well. Again, if the person is identified, and you can contact them, the name and address of the appropriate museum official to be contacted regarding the loan, and make sure that they understand that within 90 days of receiving, or 90 days of the date of the termination, the lender should remove the property or contact the museum, and failure to do so will result in a loss of the property rights. If you don't have an address or you're unable to identify information in order to send a notice, or if you send it to the last known address and you receive something back saying that the individual no longer lives there, or they do not sign for it within 30 days after the notice is mailed, it's the museum's responsibility to publish a notice of termination of loan containing all of the information that was stated in the previous slides. You have to do this at least twice, 60 days or more apart, and you want to make sure that you do that in the county in which the museum is located, and if the lender lived in a separate area, you want to do that in the county in which the lender lived as well. The museum gains property to the title if the lender does not contact the museum within 90 days after the notice was received. So that's why it's important to make sure that you are sending a registered certified letter, because they will sign for that, and then the post office will send you back that receipt so you know exactly when they signed for it, so you know when to start counting your 90 days. And also, if you have to do the publication, the lender does not contact the museum within 90 days after that second publication. And this is a copy of the unclaimed loan letter that I use. And you can see that I have the date, the lender's name and address. Dear whoever you may be, thank you for lending your materials and the majority of times it's for an exhibit. So I give the exhibit name, the dates of the exhibit, and then I just say, make sure that I put in the expiration date, that pursuant to Florida Statute 265.565, you must contact me within 90 days. And then below, I put the loan number and the artifact description. And I actually have had to send these out and have been successful with them contacting me right away. For the outgoing loan, you want to make sure, again, you have a tracking number, borrower's name, address, and all of their contact information. Again, beginning and ending dates of the loan, the purpose of the loan, description, condition, and value, and the signature and lender. A lot of this is pretty much the same for the majority of the form. And here's our outgoing loan agreement. And you can see that we have a place for the object ID, the description, the condition, value, and so forth. And here, Lake Wales Art Council. So here I am in Lake Wales, and this is for paintings that we had loaned to them in 2011. So deaccessioning, when you're actually in the process of removing items from your collection legally, you want to make sure that you have the date of the recommendation, the name and title of the person that's recommending the deaccession, the object ID, its description, condition, Any documentation, we always, along with our deaccession form, put a copy of the donor form, a catalog record, any photographs that we might have, any letters or anything, any other additional information to back up why we want to deaccession this particular item. Deaccessioning criteria, recommended disposition, and then signatures of the appropriate individuals who are approving the deaccession. You can see here's our deaccession recommendation form. It looks a little convoluted, but we want to make sure that we have a good system of checks and balances in place. And we also want to make sure that we have the curator approving, the director, our board of directors, and so forth. So there's a link for the Florida Statute 2CDocumentation. The National Park Service Museum Handbook has information on museum records. Past Perfect data entry forms can be found at the Past Perfect website. And the Texas Association of Museums form book is great. We actually use that when creating our deaccession form. You can purchase that online. They still sell that, and it's great. It's full of various forms for deaccessioning, deeds of gift, and various things like that. The Library and Archives point of view, this is going to be much quicker. The library donation form should have the date, the donor's name, address, telephone number, and email, the total number of books, CDs, etc. that have been donated, and would you like acknowledgement from the library or not. Now, I've seen instances where some libraries have in their policies that they will only send donor acknowledgement if the donor says that they want the acknowledgement, and then other policies I've seen where the library says that they will send acknowledgement to all donors. This is going to probably depend on the size of your library, so this is something that you can make specific to your institution. And here's an example of a library donation form. And you can see that this particular institution does have a place to mark whether or not acknowledgement should be received. As far as weeding is concerned, if the book is determined to be weeded, it's important to complete a disposal slip containing the title or call number, the criteria for weeding, other locations of the title, any titles that will replace the volume, and the authorizing agent. Don't forget to remove it from the catalog. This is important with deaccessioning as well. Mark the book as removed from the collection and remove all book plates, etc. And here is, this is from the, I believe it's the cruise. This is the official disposal slip that they have outlined in their standards. And you can see that it goes through all of that information. And this can be found online. I'll have the link at the end. Documentation for archives. The deed of gift, which is the legal instrument, just like for museums, transferring legal title of ownership, should include the physical and intellectual property rights. These forms should be reviewed by legal counsel and should be reviewed at least every 5 years. Again, you want to make sure you have the donor's name and contact information as well as the signature. The same with the repository's name, address, and a signature of the appropriate representative. The date of the transfer of title, so the date that it was received. The description of the material. Designation of copyright ownership, whether or not that's being passed on. The names of those authorized to dispose of any unwanted items, and any restrictions regarding the use, as well as the names of those who can impose and lift those restrictions. And here's just a sample of a deed of gift for archives. Our institution actually uses the same deed of gift for archives that we do for museums. We don't really differentiate, and we kind of operate a little bit differently because we are a museum that has an archive as well as a research library. So if any of you are in a similar situation, I can surely speak to you as to how we handle all of that. A deposit agreement is different than a deed of gift because it's a legal document that places the material in the custody of a repository without transferring a legal title. So this is done when government agencies transfer their materials to an archive. The government is still maintaining ownership of it. However, the archive now has possession of it. Again, you want to make sure that the depositor's name and contact information, the repository's name and contact information, the date of the deposit, and the time stamp for the deposit. So whether or not this is going to be for 10 years, 20 years, maybe it's going to be reviewed every 5 years. Description of the material and any restrictions. You want to make sure you have the repository's responsibility for processing as well as their responsibility in the case of loss or damage. And these last 2 points are very important since the repository does not own the materials. They are just on deposit. You want to make sure that you have the name of the depositor's representative with the authority to make decisions, the procedure for withdrawal by the depositor, the procedure for return of the materials by the repository, and descriptions of any costs to the depositor. Are you going to actually be charging the government entity any money for the storage of these materials while they're at your institution? And here's a sample deposit agreement. Documentation for the archive, the accessioning is actually the process formally accepting the materials into the custody. The records are documenting the information about how each new acquisition came about. The basic documents for all subsequent control and track the materials from the moment they enter the repository. And the record is going to consist of the accession register and accession forms. The accession forms are going to contain the accession number, the date it was received, the provenance, detailed description of the material. This is going to be more detailed than the information that was on the deed of gift. A date range of the material, the quantity size of the collection, the location within the repository, any restrictions, status, is it a gift, a deposit, a purchase, the donor or depositor information, any copyright ownership information, and any relationship to any previously accessioned materials that you may have in your archive. And here's a sample accession form for use in an archive. And again, since we are a little bit different, we don't actually use this, and I know it drives my archivist crazy because he's a traditional archivist, and so he's had to kind of bend his ways a little bit and come to the dark side of the museum world. But again, if you have any questions about how those relationships work out, please feel free to ask me. And then reappraisal leads to the accessioning within the archive. You are making the collections whole with assessing and prioritizing backlogs. You can correct faulty appraisal at the time of acquisition, comply with new laws. There's new HIPAA laws or anything like that have come out. Reappraisal will help you comply with those. Comply with current institutional collecting policies, assessing collecting strengths and refining focuses, implementing change in the repository's mission, and better balancing the research potential with the resource allocation. On the form, you want to make sure you have the information as to who conducted it, the name of the collection, any records retention schedules that might relate to it, the donor's contact information, biography history related to the collection. The correspondence collection file should be reviewed. Make sure that you have all of the deeds of gift, records, transfers, and so forth, acquisition dates, contents of the collection or series, and information as to has the collection ever been used. If it's a collection that you've had for 30 years and no one's ever touched it, you might want to get rid of it. You also want to make sure where the collection is described. Is it in a finding aid? Do you have it in an online catalog? Is it in EAD? The physical condition and history of conservation. Any collecting policies from the dates of acquisitions, have any of those changed? Who owns the collection and how? And your decision, are you going to de-accession it? Are you going to transfer it? Do you want to return it to the donor? Do you want to sell it, or do you want to simply destroy it because it's in terrible condition? The 4 options for disposition for de-accessioning are transfer, return to the donor, sale, and destruction. When transferring, make sure that you disclose all information regarding the collection. And after an agreement has been made to accept the collection, send copies of the accession file to the new repository where you sent the materials so that they do have all of the provenance and additional history that relate to the items. And also consider sending a courtesy letter to the donor or heirs, letting them know that this has taken place. If you are returning the item, which can get a little tricky, send a letter explaining why the collection is deaccessioned. No donor, for the most part, likes to ever hear that their collection is no longer needed or wanted. So always being transparent is the route to go. You want to make sure that you document the process. You want to retain and file all of the information about the collection and its creator, any donor communication, the correspondence that you've done with any other repositories if you're transferring or seeing if any other institutions are interested, any meeting minutes related to the deaccession of the item, forms, checklists, and other paperwork, as well as the original files from the accession. You never want to get rid of those items. And here's a little bit more. Delete the catalog records. Always delete, 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 because you'd hate to have something out on the web and somebody actually had this happen. We had something that's in our deaccession pile, and I had somebody want a copy of it. So I had to get with my archivist and say, hey, I know we still have this, so can we get a copy of it to this individual? Destroy the inventories that are available to researchers, but always make sure you keep a master copy for your administrative files. Update your accession records and maintain information about the disposition of the collection. You want to retain internal collection database detailed information about the deaccession collection or record series, and make sure that you do not reuse the collection or accession number. And here's a sample deaccession order for archives. Again, we use the same deaccession forms for our library, photo collection, archives, and objects. We just make sure that we indicate which collection it's referring to. And here are the links. CREW, the Weeding Manual for Modern Libraries, can be found at that website, and that's where those disposal slips were. The SAA Guide to Deeds of Gift can be found on the Society of American Archivists website. And the guidelines for reappraisal and deaccessioning are also on the Society of American Archivists website. And that's it. Thank you.
My head is spinning. This is Miriam. That was a huge amount of information. Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you for such a clear walkthrough of the laws around abandoned property. If body language in this room was any indication of how useful that was across all the cities, I mean, I think that that was really important information, so thank you so much. Let me take a quick look around and see if anybody has questions for Stephanie. I'm going to hand over the microphone to Kristen Zimmerman from the Comer, who has a question here.
Hi, Stephanie. Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question specifically about unclaimed property. The museum has a very valuable piece that we had appraised a couple years ago, and we are interested in selling. However, we have absolutely no documentation as to whether it was given to us as a loan, a potential gift, or basically anything. We have no documentation. I can tell you it's probably been in our collection for at least 30 years, but I was wondering if you have any suggestions on how we could go about if we wanted to deaccession it or try to sell it, if you have any suggestions on how we could move forward with that.
Well, Kristen, that's quite a dilemma. What you might want to do, just to comply with the unclaimed property, is place notices in the newspapers. Go about it that route. Maybe somebody will read those and say, oh, that sounds like Uncle Joe's piece of art, or whatever it might be. Then, of course, you're going to get into trying to figure out whether or not somebody is a legal heir to that actual piece. But I would go ahead and side on the, err on the side of caution and pretend that you don't have any information, but go for the unidentified and actually do the publishing within your county You're not going to obviously be able to do it in the county of the individual who owns the item because you have no idea who brought it to you. But at least that way you're doing due diligence on your part. And if somebody were to come back to you, you could say, you know, we did put this notice out.
Stephanie, there's another question, which is, do you have any examples of artifacts in your museum for which you have no documentation? And so basically, I think it's another question about, can you give another example? Because I think that this undocumented objects is really resonating with people. So if you might give us one more example from your collection.
I wish I could give one example. But we do have a lot of artifacts within our collection that are undocumented. The majority of times we consider those just to be found in collection and we treat them as such. We haven't really deaccessioned anything. Our museum was actually pretty good about completing loan paperwork, and I have loan paperwork going back quite far. So for the most part, I know whether or not something was donated. But we try, at this point, not to really deaccession things that we don't know whether or not it was a loan or it's actually a donation. We just, for the time being, are cataloging them as found in collections items, and then hopefully someday when we all have more time in our life, we'll be able to figure out those issues.
This is Lynn Robertson. I was interested in the fact.
This is Miriam. I'll take one more question before we move on.
This is Lynn Robertson. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Lynn. This is Stephanie.
Okay. I was interested in the fact that you said you never use pencil. The last that I heard having to do with emergency situations is that your basic documents should be in pencil, because if you have a water disaster of any kind, it's never just water. It's the chemicals and dirt and soot and whatever else that gets picked up as it leaks through the roof, salt water from the bay, etc., and it does terrible things to ink, including fading them out completely, whereas pencil is always there. It might be faint, but you can still read it. Of course, this is for the catalog records.
Well, I didn't say I never use pencil. I just said that if you are looking for long-term stability, to actually make sure that you try and use a permanent ink, something that's not going to run, something that's going to be fast and stick with the paper. That's not to say that you can't ever use pencil. It's just a lot of times it's easier to read. But you're right. In the case of an emergency, if something happens, ink will bleed if the paper gets wet and so forth. And that's why it's always important to have those backup documents, making sure that you have those copies in safe locations so that if you do have a disaster and something does happen to your original documents, you do have those copies that are safe. But yeah, and obviously, if I'm doing a catalog record and I have an artifact right beside me, I'm not going to use pen. But with my donation paperwork and things like that, I make sure that I always use pen, or I use my, I don't use an inkjet, I use a laser jet printer.
Thanks very much, Lynn, for that comment. I think that was an important clarification for all of us.